after this, after the webinar finishes, we'll get this put on our website. Our guest this afternoon, I think you all know Kay Aiken. Kay is a systems architect, energy strategist, and entrepreneur. She's CEO of Dynamic Grid, an advanced utility controls and energy storage company developing distributed intelligent systems to integrate distributed energy resources to the electric grid. Kay has a degree in energy engineering from Penn State and has worked on early renewable energy in construction. She's been in executive leadership roles across business development, product strategy, and regulatory engagement. But Kay is well able to speak for herself, and I'm going to actually hand over to Scott and Kay now, and Scott will talk to Kay in a fireside chat. It's not going to be a PowerPoint presentation. And we're going to, as in the usual format of our webinars, Scott will ask questions. Kay will respond as best she can. If anyone in the audience has a question or wants to ask a question, please feel free to raise your virtual hand, and you will be, Scott usually gives way to whoever wants to ask the question. And if you don't want to ask the question yourself, or if your meeting is unstable, you can type your question into the chat and we'll get to that. So Scott and Kay, I'm going to hand over to you. Scott, go ahead, and I'm going to mute.
All right. Thank you very much, Barbara Ann, and good afternoon, good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you as well. We're going to have this fireside chat, as Barbara Ann has said, and the focus is going to be on, I'll say, systems thinking. The context is that there's a sense that we can actually really improve our chances of mitigating climate change, of getting to our sustainability objectives, and getting a better blend of the human and natural environments if we were to really deploy a systems thinking approach. And this is one of the stage setting events for the summit, because this will be a topic that's woven through the whole agenda. So the issue at hand, what we're going to talk about today, is systems thinking and how that actually improves on traditional approaches. So to start us off, I'll just ask you a very broad softball question, Kay, of can you explain systems thinking and how does that differ from how most people think and work?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Scott and Barbara Ann. So systems thinking is about seeing the whole system rather than individual parts. So think about ecosystems. We're not looking at just the frog or just the snake. We're looking at how the snake and the frog interact and the environment they're in. This is a systems of systems. This is individual things working together, interacting, being coordinated, and they create an ecosystem. So traditionally, we all are, as problem solvers, we look at what part is broken. So in the case of climate change, we're looking at right now, we need to decarbonize. We got too much carbon in the system. But there's a whole pile of interrelated results, things that happen because we're working with systems of systems. And systems thinkers really look at it is, what is the system doing right now? How is it reacting? And to produce this result of too much carbon, and what are all the things that interact to cause that result? So it's really a shift in perspective when you look at problems. My partner, Carol Johnson, and I really talk about applied science and traditional. We think of it as three different types of people. We have the true pure scientists, like in the building I'm in right now at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, who are looking at materials. They've got the largest MRI in the world sitting here in this building. And they're just looking at pure science to figure out how molecules and atoms work, materials work. Then there are engineers who are given an A and a B. They're given a starting point and they're giving an ending point and said, find the quickest path to it. While the systems thinkers are applied scientists, they're given a problem. We have climate change. Well, how do we apply science and apply technology in a systems way to get our final result, to get to solve the problem? And that's what systems thinkers do. They look at the proverbial forest rather than the tree.
That's actually quite clear. Thank you for that. Again, to the audience, as Barbara Ann said, if you have a question along the way, just raise your hand. I will call on you probably immediately because your questions are probably a lot smarter than mine are. But there you go. Jim Collins wrote a book a long time ago, From Good to Great, and it's talking about organizations. And one of the issues that he raised was this idea, do you want to be as smart as a fox, thinking about everything and being clever on everything? Or do you want to be focused like a hedgehog? The hedgehog has one thing it wants to do, which is to go get that snail, and it tends to be very good at it. So I'm wondering if that's kind of mixed messaging, is trying to get people to think about everything and yet wanting them to be very good at this. Is there a tension in there, or do you think those two can coexist?
I think they definitely can coexist. And the analogy I use is that going back to that, the snake and the frog. I depending upon your religious background, I say there is no God. The frog has its own intelligence and it's very good at surviving and getting flies. And the snake in the swamp is very good at finding frogs to eat. But what's important is the interactions between those. So you can have a specialist, you can have a frog who's very good at getting flies and surviving, and a snake that's very good at finding frogs and surviving. But it's the interactions and the coordination between it. And that's, as humans, we need to step back and see that emergent behavior. We talk about complex adaptive systems in the science world, and the world is a complex adaptive system. If I make a decision, it affects not just myself, but it affects everyone. So that's the idea. So I don't see it as a tension.
Okay. Mike has asked a question in the chat, but I want to integrate that into the last question I'm going to ask you. So I won't do that right now, but it's how do you deal with an anti-science government? Let everybody dwell on that for a moment. If I take a systems thinking approach and I only think about the building and what's inside the envelope of an individual building, how do I apply systems thinking within the context of a building? What does that do for us to have systems thinking within the building?
So some of my favorite people are architects. I started out in architecture. I was at University of Miami under Elizabeth Plater-Zybrick, who was, I think of her as a systems thinker. Sorry. Slight interruption. I'm acting as a wayfarer. Platinum, Ron. Next door down. Sorry. I'm currently at a meeting for the Gridwise Architecture Council, which is an advisory board for the U.S. Department of Energy on grid architecture aspects. So architects are one of my favorite people, but I think of them almost like dancers, choreographers. They're choreographing the relationship of technology with the people inside it. But they're also choreographing the experience people have outside that building. And on a grander scale, the building is a part of the community and a part of the environment it sits in. And generally, architects are very good, at least some architects. I think I would like to say many architects are very good at understanding the context of how that building carries space inside the community. And that's where architecture connects to politics, connects to zoning, connects to urban planning, et cetera, et cetera. So you can apply systems thinking to both the building itself inside its envelope and also in a larger context outside of that envelope.
If I think about something that Bob Cavey has always mentioned to me, that there's been a natural tension between the building envelope people, the passive folks, and the systems folks, the HVAC and the rest of it. Um, it would seem to me that systems thinking would be a pretty effective way of integrating those two perspectives, that we're not in tension with one another, but we need to be in a collaborative with one another. That you want to get the building design right, the materials right, and everything else, but there has to be this concept of providing the services that people require inside the building. Is that how you would see it?
I would see it that way, but I'd also add another layer to it, and that is how the building provides services to the community. And
Mm.
not just services. We talk about grid integration, not only, the building being a microgrid perhaps, and at certain times exporting power to the system, and other times importing power, and being a good citizen. But it's also about how the building supports the environment, how it
Mhm.
supports the community it's in, the people around it and who use it, both directly inside the building, but also how they um, experience the building, and how the building is. I get back to the choreography. The
Mhm.
choreography is not about the dancing. It's about how the audience responds to the dancing.
Okay.
That's really the key point, and architects do that job, try to do that job to a very good effect.
Well, let's move to the community level, which you've emphasized several times. I'm sure you're familiar with the what used to be a four-circle Venn diagram because the circles overlapped, but as the number of circles has expanded, it's becoming quite large. Um, if I wanted to apply systems thinking at the community level, the built environment, and you and Mike and I have been working on this grid interconnection, which is the power grid. But if I add on to that water and mobility and food and everything else, um, it seems that we're not delivering on what sustainability will require. And it seems that we're not delivering on what climate change mitigation requires. Every time a new data set comes out, nothing's changed. How would you think that systems thinking can improve the behaviors and the performance of the built environment? So it's not just a building, but communities of buildings and how they coordinate.
Well, I'll give you an example of what we have done historically over the last 50 or 60 years, especially in the United States, which has gone badly. And these are the things that system thinking approaches have to solve. And I think about low growth strategies. Back in the 50s or 60s, they'd say, oh, we want to hold down growth, so we're going to put in 1 acre zoning. And what that did actually is require developers to go out into the suburban farm communities and split up lots into 1 acre plots. And now you required roads, you required new water infrastructure, you had a whole pile of grass that had to be put pesticides on it, a whole pile of cascading effects because we didn't look at it as a system. And Europe, partly because of its traditions of being a more city-centric communities, countries, didn't have as much as that. It's much more urban, much more built up. So transportation, and in Belgium, you can ride anywhere you want on a very large part of the area on bikes. And that lowered transportation costs. It didn't require interstates that America gets. So that's where the systems thinking, I hope I'm answering the question. I think I went off on a tangent, but that's where the systems thinking is pulling back and seeing what's my decision, my design solution here, and what other things, interdependencies is it causing?
Mhm. If I go then one step beyond, coming back to your frog and your snake, but thinking about the built environment for humans and the natural environment, which we're screwing up royally, um, how can systems thinking allow us to optimize both protecting the natural environment and ensuring that quality of life that people require is being satisfied in the community of buildings?
Yeah, it's a really hard one. Um, yeah, we just have to start. I think there's two aspects. Is we need to build uh, practitioners, systems thinking practitioners, and get these ideas out in a much more greater. I think, we talked about Donella Meadows at Dartmouth and wrote the systems thinking, which is a very easy to grab book for a broad audience, and it really talks about how systems affect us all. So I think it's a combination of getting leaders to understand, and I'm hoping that the conference next month is going to be able to talk about these issues and get decision makers to start understanding how their decisions have to be seen in a context, in a lens of systems thinking. And then I think we need to broaden the scope, is get all of us thinking in systems rather than thinking about parochial, our own little small silo.
Mhm.
If we start thinking about how our decisions affect other decisions, and other people, I think we'll be better off.
If I think of three different pots, if you will, one pot is all of the Venn diagram circles. That includes the building envelope, the systems, the energy sources that drive the systems, the mobility, the water, the food, the waste, the planners and the urban designers, even the real estate industry. And that's all of the stakeholders who are involved in delivering the built environment. Then I think about all the outcomes that we've been talking about for a long time of what is it we're looking for. It's health, it's climate, it's carbon intensity, energy efficiency, resilience, affordability, and the rest of it is outcomes. And then we think about the communities of actors that the BAC comprises, which is education and these um, centers of excellence and the youth movement and all of the different groups, industry groups. Um, how can I achieve the outcomes that we want and get them to think in terms of systems while doing what they are actually wanting to achieve? In other words, I want an architect to be an architect, but I want them to raise their head above the clouds and think systems wide from time to time. What machinery can we put in place to get that to happen?
So, so I listened to your question and I realized you're talking all about technicians. You're talking about technologists.
Hmm.
And we actually have to engage and I'm sorry, I've got a mower outside.
We
We
don't
have
hear
to,
it. You're good.
good. We have to engage political leaders. We have to engage decision makers in our communities, and get them to understand that, because I don't think just technologists. I can't impart change. I can talk about systems thinking. I can talk about and deploy it in my work. But the unless the people who are setting policy embrace systems thinking and allow us to do that in a broad sense, we won't get there. So I really think it's about getting the decision makers to embrace it.
That's an interesting observation. And I'm going to go back in time, my own time. We were talking about getting real change on sustainability. And our board of directors at the United Nations, they were called something else, but everybody knows what a board of directors is, observed that you need to have grassroots support to bring to the table the people, elect the politicians who are able to take real action without fear of being tossed out of office the next time around. So if they're not ready to deal with climate change because they think they're going to lose the election, they're not going to. Whereas if they know that if they do these things, so you want the decision makers isn't there an argument to be made that this needs to be democratized and get communities as a whole to support this initiative?
So I agree with you. And I think I kind of refer to that is we all have to be systems thinkers. We all have to get out of looking at the forest rather than the tree. We can't look at the sick tree and try to solve the sick tree because that's just a symptom of the health of the forest. We need to go back and look at what are we doing to the forest to do that. And that takes both sides, actually. It's a push-pull. We have to have the push by the people and then the pull by the decision makers to actually implement. So it's a two-way street.
But I just heard a political commentator in the United States, and this is not a commentary on American politics, but the observation was don't talk about inflation because people don't give a hoot about inflation. What they're worried about is the price of the groceries in the store. And it's the same thing. But
Mhm.
if you start talking about systems thinking, you've just cruised over most people's frame of mind at around 32,000 feet. The comms issue is huge.
It is huge. There's no easy answers to this.
Hmm.
Because I don't think we're talking about a complex adaptive system. We're trying to cure the ills that man has made over the last 1,000 years, and really badly in the last 75 years. So there's no easy answers to this problem. I just know, or at least I believe, the solution is to look at problems holistically, not look at the things that are broken, but look at why they're broken.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, when I walk around uh, parts of France and I see new buildings going up, they all look the same. There's a certain tedium that emerges from everybody's got the same design, they got the same windows, they got the same. It's just economic to do cookie cutter approach to construction. And you can change the standard all you want to, but there's a loss of an individual expression. How can we marry a systems thinking approach, which would seem to lend itself to homogenized approaches? And what people value is an individual expression. Again, it's a question of tension. Do you see any tension between those two of cookie cutter versus individual
Well, I
approaches?
actually think systems thinking can build heterogeneity, can build more variety, because there's lots of ways to solve problems, to
Hmm.
solve a challenge. When I did design build work early in my 20s and 30s, I would prefer to find the construction site that was hard to build on, that no one else wanted to build on, because it was cheaper. And what that did was it forced me to think from a system standpoint of how to design a building in a more innovative way that met the client's needs of inexpensive housing or less expensive housing. So I had to be innovative in materials. I had to be innovative in massing. I had to be innovative in fenestration. I had to be innovative in a whole host of ways. And that was a systems thinking approach. It
Hmm.
was started with this is land no one else wants. It's buildable if I'm creative.
Hmm.
So I actually think the best buildings are the ones that have challenges. The reason why we get cookie cutter is because everyone goes and clears all the trees off of a site and they go and put a building in there. They don't leave the trees and go, well, let me build around the tree. They go and cut the tree down and then plop the building on top of it and then replant trees.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's nuts.
All right. I'm going to continue going, but I do encourage anybody who's in the audience, either if you've got a question or if you have a reaction to how your community would react to a systems thinking approach. Is that too esoteric? Is it something that people would be able to embrace? Oh, I've got Bob Cavey with a question. So, Bob, fire away. You made the mistake of putting your hand up.
Yeah, somewhere between a question and a comment, but certainly I'll throw something out and see what all of you do with it. When I first got into this sort of issue, I thought I had discovered that, and was coming out of more political policy s kind of world. I thought I had discovered that the political issues, at least as they appeared on the normal political agenda, were not the center of gravity, to my surprise, that it was the technological issues. That if you get the technology right, and right includes make it commercial, that the problem would solve itself. The markets would drive the process. After knocking around in this stuff for a while, I came to think that was probably wrong. And it was wrong both because of the amount of resistance in the world to even thinking about some of the stuff. And it was wrong because what I'll call vaguely, but not, I don't mean it too pejoratively at first, the entrenched interest, the stuff, the cement that was already poured, so to speak, was resistant to it for not irrational reasons in every case, but for lots of reasons that didn't respond to current commercial trends or potential trends. Long story short, then, there was just too much blowback, too much resistance from sources that you could call broadly cultural. And therefore, you would need a cultural transition. And cultural transitions are big, stinking things. That's a complex world. So let me kind of wrap this up just by asking, so if what we're barking at is the need for a cultural change, does that mean we need to radicalize ourselves a lot more than we've customarily been? What methodologies are there for creating cultural change? How does one go about that, if I'm right that is going to be necessary to move us off this dime?
I'll have a
Oh,
reaction, but I'll let Kay get the first shot at it.
yeah. So unfortunately, I am a technologist and I'm not a cultural anthropologist. So do we have any cultural anthropologists in the audience? Yeah, it's a tough change,
Well,
and I think
I would just say I noticed you gravitated right away to from one science to another. And if I'm not mistaken, the question is scientific civilization able to cure itself, or does it need something outside itself to come in and reshape it? In other
yeah,
words, the
it
last
needs
thing I might need is a goddamn cultural anthropologist, but keep going.
it needs the great meteor so we can start over again. Sorry, that's an inside joke with my family. We talk about how to solve all of our problems is by having the great meteor crash into the earth, and we'll just let humanity start over again. It's
The
definitely a
traditional
cultural change.
formulation of that is no more water but fire next time, I think.
It's definitely a cultural change, Bob, and that is education. That is explaining to people how the way we've always done it is not the problem. I get this in the utility industry all the time. I talk to utility engineers. I talk to presidents of utilities, and the argument is, well, that's the way we've always done it. And those are those entrenched interests you talk about. So all I can do is try to be a thought leader and explain the advantages to understanding the interdependencies and interactions and how we can create emergent behavior in that system to improve the overall system. That's probably all I can do because I'm not Empress K of the world. But I'm open to election to that position if you want. So all I can do is try to educate.
Let me come in on this one. My experience and what has been recounted to me by others is that if you try to go in and tell a community that this is the way it needs to be, invariably that doesn't work. What you need to do is get the community to collaborate and to arrive at the outcome that they've generated. Because if you've made it, you own it. And they are able to internalize it is if they're in the process. And I think that's an important element.
It's a very
There,
important element.
there are two comments that have come into the chat. I'm going to reread what Mike Oldak said, which is how do we move forward with an anti-science U.S. government? Again, I want to come back to that one a little bit later on. But David Moran has added systems thinking. An example would be the net zero EU legislation. This is in the chat. In this, architects are being encouraged to think of the base source of the energy their buildings are using, both embodied and operational energy. The direct impact on the environment is only really seasonal and needs more work. By work, as with net zero, legislation invoked is based on people's understanding. Um, I would think that there are a number of avenues that we could take to change how people deliver results, calling it systems thinking or not calling it systems thinking. There are standards, there are certification processes, there are training sessions, there are all sorts of um, methods that one can use to bring people along, um, both by requirement, carrot and stick, I would say. Um, a complaint was made to me recently, specifically about one conference, but this applies to all of them. Everybody shows up, they talk to each other. This is the way they've talked to each other forever. Then they go back and keep doing what they did before. Nothing has changed. So our challenge, we face this, everybody faces this. How do we make real changes happen? Systems thinking is part of that, and we need to convince people that they need to move in that direction. I want to ask this of Kay in particular, but do you agree that standards and certification schemes and trainings are the right approach to take? And then I want to ask the audience if they agree with that as well. Kay, what do you think?
So I think it's part of the approach, but unfortunately, we implement standards badly. So I think back to LEED, it's a flawed system because you can game it. I think back to if I went and said that every building in my city that I live in, Portland, Maine, had to be net zero, we would never get there. We're really talking about holistic. Overall, we have to make the community better. Every building can't be net zero necessarily, especially, hey, there are buildings that are, I think the Enniscorthy Castle. Can David tell me how we would make that net zero? I don't see how. But it's a cultural icon. It is something that we want to keep. So we have to find, David said, the energy source. We have to find ways to build the synergies in the community to offset the saving of the Enniscorthy Castle. And I think that's where systems thinking really has its power, is not setting a standard of we're going to build all net zero buildings or we're going to renovate all buildings to 80% improvement or whatever. We're going to overall improve all the stock. So for instance, a standard to me would be we're going to concentrate our resources, because we have limited resources, to the worst buildings. And we're going to keep building the worst buildings up. And by that, we're going to get the biggest bang for the buck and improve the entire building stock. Just one example.
If I come back to Mike's comment about the anti-science U.S. government, I might be naive on this one. It's something I'm always guilty of. The idea that we're doing high performance buildings in order to mitigate climate change and in order to progress along the arc of sustainable development, social justice, and the rest of it, will speak to one audience, but it won't speak to the other audiences that are out there. So I would think that if we have a argument palette, a series of different arguments that we can make, because The way we're going is innovation and creativity, which you've already mentioned, Kay. It's affordability, it's resilience. High performance buildings ought to be more insurable because they're the ones that resist fire and floods and drought and hurricanes and the rest of it better than other kinds of buildings. So this whole relationship to the financing and the financial aspect, health aspects, employment aspects, it seems to me that we can tailor the argument for different audiences, and for an anti-science government, those other arguments would be more resonating. What do you think?
I totally agree with you, Scott. I think the environmentalists, and I'm loath to say conservatives, they're theoretically the conservatives, but I haven't seen any conservatism. We talk past each other.
Yeah.
And the bottom line is, I like to say this: we've got 10% of the people who will spend money to save the planet. We've got 10% of the people who will spend money to destroy the planet, to rape it. And we've got 80% of the people, and I don't know what the percentages are, we got 80% of the people who just want it to be cheaper because they want to take care of their family. The Maslow hierarchy of
Needs.
needs says if you don't have food, you don't care about anything else. You care about food. So we actually have to create the economic capability to care, and we need to create the financial incentives to care.
Mhm.
Those things relate, and that is the argument we make to the farther right people, but then talk to the environmentalists and say, this is how we have to talk, and it's a win-win for both sides.
Right.
Let me give you an example. We talk about the fires in Altadena and Pacific Palisades this last year in January. And they're talking about rebuilding 22,000 houses. Well, what if we rebuilt that to be more dense, to be more community-centric, and create new fire breaks so that the next time there's a fire, we don't have a $500 billion or whatever number insurance bill? That's a conservative approach. That is an approach that saves money just by reorienting how we rebuild.
Mhm. That's interesting. Mike has added another question, and I do object to it strenuously, and I will explain why in a minute, but let me at least read it out. Doesn't a systems approach require, on a finger on the scale, subsidies to monetize the climate goals? And my objection is that I would suggest that the costs of emitting carbon have not been paid by the emitters of carbon. And I wouldn't call that a subsidy. I would say that that's something that people haven't paid. And if you suddenly started to include a price, and I'm going to make a price up, say $250 per ton of carbon, that's the kind of number you need in order to undo the damage that has been done to date. And when you translate $250 a ton of carbon into methane, that becomes a very big number because of the CO2 equivalence of methane on climate. But it also goes into embedded carbon, it goes into fossil fuel emissions, and it doesn't require you to build renewables because there are other approaches to climate change mitigation. Um, and he added a subsidy is what somebody else gets. Anyway, do you want to react to what Mike has proposed? Finger on
So
the scale
I
for.
will argue with both of you if that's possible.
Okay, go for it.
I think the premise of the questions and the answer both sides is wrong. It should be about how systems thinking can make the system better.
Mhm.
the old way of talking about Mike, and I guess now Mike and I generally agree 98% of the time, and now we only agree 97% of the time because he just broke another. We don't agree. The subsidies is the top-down approach to getting getting behavior change.
Mhm.
And that is a flawed approach because it never survives. It never, ever, very seldom does it actually build something that a economic system that doesn't survive on the subsidies. We have to have the investment tax credit continually now for the next 40 years in order to get enough solar and storage. I don't want to be dependent upon incentive tax credit, the investment tax credit in the US. There are ways for us to use systems thinking to be creative, to figure out how to, for instance, my case, putting a microgrid in can save money, make the building better, and save the system money without the investment tax credit. So those are the things we need to try to find.
Mhm.
And then I disagree with you, Scott, but I forgot what exactly why.
You're welcome to disagree on whatever basis you'd like. I'm going to pick on David here real quick, and I apologize, but yours is the picture that's on the screen, and you've made these comments. Do you find the net zero and the near zero approaches in Europe and in Ireland to be approaches that would encourage systems thinking? Is it likely to be effective at raising the bar?
Um, I think it does, but it comes nowhere close to as far as it should in terms of encouraging people. It like from my own professional understanding of the net zero, the legislation has changed and has actually forced those of us who are careful enough to look at it properly. It forces us to think of where the energy is coming from. The net zero isn't Enniscorthy Castle not achieving its net zero. It's actually the house, the building is only a little part of the whole system.
Right.
And the system is where the energy comes from. And it focuses our attention more on that. It doesn't focus our attention on the environment, and it doesn't focus our attention on the philosophy of why we should be doing it so much. Like we're all very aware of the philosophy why we should be doing it. But what I mean is it it does go maybe 5%, 10% of the way. And what Kay said about the application of standards and implementation of legislation is very, very poor.
Mhm.
And it's very poor because of what people can get away with. And that is a big mindset. If we got rid of that mindset and started doing what we should do rather than what we can do, we would actually probably multiply the amount of the net zero approach that we'd actually achieve.
Which comes back to Bob's point that we need to be more radical in our stomping on the roof, on the foot. Okay?
To a certain extent, I agree. So to build off of what David said, I think our standards are building centric generally, but we have to make our net zero standards to be community centric.
Mhm.
And that means, I think David would agree, it's easier to build a multifamily net zero building than it is a single family net zero building. So those are the kind of things that the standards don't pick up well of how do we use land? How do the buildings interact with the transportation system? How do they interact with the community? Are we putting all the residences 3 miles away from the city center? You know, those are the things that we have to kind of elevate the net zero argument to a higher level.
I mentioned the tension between the systems people and the passive people. There's another tension between the grid people and the non-grid people, people who think we don't need what's provided via the grid. We can produce our own energy, we can do everything the right way. It seems to me that those are all extremes because if the building is done the right way, it can support decarbonization of the sources of energy that are delivered via the grid. And there's a symbiosis there, communities of buildings and the networks, that if they're coordinated and organized properly, will deliver superior results. And to me, that's systems thinking at work.
That's exactly right. So we need to build what I would call engineered ecosystems. And the reason why I use that kind of formulation is we're building networks of networks. And you just talked about that. We got the buildings, the group of buildings, the group of buildings in the communities, how those interact. Those are networks of networks. And the strength of us in using the parlance of systems thinking, of not really systems thinking, but of architecture, systems architecture. The value in the overall systems of systems is in the interconnections. And we don't do a good job of focusing on the interconnections between systems. We look at systems in silos.
Right.
And we really need to look at those connections, because that's how we build a network of networks, the network effect. It's the network effect.
Okay.
That's how Facebook survived. It's because of the connections, not because of the things.
Well, the things that have struck me about this conversation are the essential need for outreach and communications in language that the counterparties are able to understand. And we tend to speak, we on this call and we in our community tend to speak a language that is not something you'd be a hero for at the cocktail party. They're interested in other stuff. So somehow we've got to work on who our target audience is, how we communicate with them, and what we're trying to convince them of. So it's a bit of a mobilization and targeting the right actors. It's the decision makers, and it's the people who put those decision makers in their place.
Yes.
That's a challenge.
Both ends of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm. All right.
You know,
Good.
I think as a technologist, more so, system theorist, I guess. I'm not the problem necessarily. I don't think David Moran is the problem. We're all part of the solution, but it's moving the bottom and the top of the system.
Okay. I see Naomi has had to hop off, so bye, Naomi, but she's already gone. We're going to be going through a similar set of discussions at the summit. So we will have the coherence between the natural environment and the built environment as one of the topics. We will be having the retrofit approach, the integration with grids, and suddenly you find in this one webinar a number of different tangents and themes that add up to the systems thinking approach permeates pretty much every session at the summit. So I'm hoping that you'll be able to keep this in mind as we go forward. I mentioned this at the outset, but many of you hadn't connected yet. Encourage you to get your registrations in, because we want to see you in Enniscorthy on June 17 to 19. Get those into Barbara Ann. I don't know if anybody's got a last comment or question. Kay, I don't know if you have any further observations. And if not, I'm going to turn it back to Barbara Ann for a bit of a wrap up. If Barbara Ann is still with us.
I'm still with you, but everyone's very quiet. Thank you so much. Kay's explanation at the beginning really made it accessible. So anyone who didn't understand what was being talked about knew exactly what we were going to talk about. So thank you so much for making it very accessible, Kay. Really do appreciate.
Thank you.
You're making the effort and bringing it down to layman's language, which is what I needed to be able to understand exactly what you're talking about. Really enjoyed it. So thank you, and Scott, for all the work you put into doing this. And we look forward to seeing you in Enniscorthy in a month's time. It's from my point of view, I need to know what bums are going on seats. So everyone, not only for the audience who are on today, but the audience who will be joining us to watch this online. I'd love to see you all in Enniscorthy in June. email me, ba@enniscorthyforum.org. That's ENNISCORTHYFORUM.org for information and to register. And we won't be having a webinar in June because it's just the week before our summit. We will be coming back to our next webinar in July, which will possibly be a wrap up on what we did in our summit. We haven't lined up someone to speak yet, and then we will resume again in September. So it will wrap up before the summer in July. So if anyone would like to speak at any of our webinars, just drop me a line as well to ba@enniscorthyforum.org on what you would suggest you'd like to talk about, whether it would be an interview such as we've had with Kay, or a PowerPoint presentation, or a mix of the two. Just come on to me with your suggestion, because it would be Scott who will be doing the interview, and we would work together. We ensure for each webinar that we're no longer than 1 hour, so you know exactly how long you're committing in your diary. And that's really important for people to know. I will try to get the notifications out the week earlier rather than just save the date, so that everyone has them in their calendars. And we will work on that one to try to make sure that it happens. People have requested that we do so. So if no one else has any questions or comments, it's a beautiful evening here in Ireland. We haven't had a May this sunny since the year 2020, when we were all in the middle of that pandemic and having to stay within 2 kilometers of home. So we're going to get out and enjoy the evening if we can. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you again soon. And
thank you all.
I do apologize, I forgot to switch back on my camera. See you all again. Thank you.
Thank
See you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.